Before the dawn fully commits to rising, the land around Ypres holds a strange, uneasy stillness. You hover along the front near Langemark, drifting above the wooden boards and mud walls of shallow trenches that seem half swallowed by the earth. The air is cold enough to sting the skin, but it carries another sensation too, something faint, metallic, almost imperceptible, as if the morning itself is bracing for a revelation it would rather not deliver. Before you drift off, take a moment to subscribe, but only if stories carried on quiet winds feel like home to you. And if the mood finds you, tell us where you're listening from tonight, or which moment, which image, lingers in your thoughts like a fading breath on the Western Front. You're listening to echoes of war. Around you, soldiers begin to stir. Not quickly, not with any sense of urgency, just the slow, habitual movements of men who have repeated these motions for far too many mornings. A kettle rattles against a mess tin. Steam rises in a thin, pale ribbon. A pair of hands rub warmth back into stiff fingers. Uniforms shift, blankets fold, boots scrape along duckboards damp with night mist. Their exhaustion colors everything. Even their breath sounds tired. Somewhere in the near distance, a few men exchange soft, half-formed thoughts about the strange light of the morning, wondering whether the sky intends to brighten or simply remain stuck in this muted veil forever. Another voice mutters something about the odd clarity of the horizon, as if the fields have been scrubbed of their usual haze. Yet nothing seems dramatically wrong, just off, in a way no one can quite name. You move toward the parapet, drawn by a faint disturbance in the air. The landscape ahead is a jigsaw of broken farms, shattered trees, and shallow depressions where water collects in shimmering pools. It should look familiar, the weary, scarred geography of months of stalemate, yet today it seems subtly altered, as though shadows cling too long to the edges of things. Then you notice it. A thin, pale streak drifting along the German lines. Slow, tentative, almost delicate. At first, it resembles ordinary fog, early morning vapors rising from churned earth. But something in its movement pulls at the edges of your awareness. Fog rises. Fog disperses. This rolls. It clings low, refusing to lift, stretching across the field like a living thing crawling on its belly. Near you, shoulders stiffen, heads lift, eyes narrow, not in fear, not yet, but in recognition of the unnatural. A quiet murmur drifts through the trench, the kind of uncertain thought men speak when they are trying not to alarm themselves. Someone nearby remarks on the unusual weight of the mist, as if the air has forgotten its own rules. Another guesses the Germans must be burning rubbish again. A third wonders aloud whether the breeze has shifted. The breeze. Yes, that is the part that matters. It moves steadily from the northeast, brushing gently across the ruined fields, flowing from the German trenches toward the Allied line. You feel it as a cool thread on your cheek, carrying with it that faint metallic tang, a taste of something sharp, something chemical, something the wind itself seems reluctant to deliver. The mist thickens. Not much, barely enough for a casual observer to notice. But to those who have lived among trenches long enough to sense danger before it takes shape, its transformation is unmistakable. The color of it begins to change. Gray bleeds into yellow. Yellow sours toward green. A sickly green, the color of decaying leaves pressed too long in water, or the surface of stagnant ponds when summer grows too warm. It spreads as if guided by purpose, its edges curling and folding over the earth. It does not hurry. It does not falter. It simply moves. In the Colonial sector to your left, the Algerian and Moroccan troops rise from their positions, peering across no man's land. Their silhouettes tense as they sense that what approaches is not fog. Their officers gesture toward the growing haze, urging the men to stay alert, to cover their faces with whatever damp cloth they can find. You drift closer. The cloud continues its slow, steady advance. It glows strangely under the muted sunlight, as if light itself recoils from touching it too directly. The soldiers around you adjust their scarves, dampen kerchiefs with water, tighten wool around their noses. None of them have proper masks. There is no manual yet for how to face a threat that moves like breath. A stray gust of wind pushes a faint wisp toward your position. Your eyes begin to sting. Not sharply, not painfully, just enough for your body to understand that something here is wrong. Deeply wrong. A low rustle of unease moves through the trenches. Men shift their feet. Some glance anxiously toward officers. Others stare toward the glowing band crawling across the ground. Then the wind strengthens just slightly, enough to send the thickest part of the cloud rolling into the Colonial lines. From across the field, a wave of coughing erupts. Violent, immediate, unmistakably wrong. Bodies bend forward. Hands grab at throats. Cloth-wrapped faces jerk with desperate, stifled breaths. Some men stagger upward onto parapets, trying to escape the deepening pool of haze gathering in their trenches. Others drop to their knees, choking on air that betrays them. It happens so quickly you feel time lose its shape. One moment, the trenches hold. The next, they dissolve into frantic, scattered shapes swallowed by the green tide. You hover above it, breath caught in your chest, though you do not suffer as they do. Your vantage does not protect you from the knowledge of what is happening. The air has turned poisonous. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. Something new has entered this war. Something drifting, unseen, intimate. Something that seeks out lungs. Something that makes breath itself an enemy. And in that sickly, shimmering light, as the cloud crawls across the fields and men stumble blindly through a world suddenly altered, you feel the truth settle into the land like a verdict. A line has been crossed, and nothing in this war will ever be the same again. Rumors of something new. The cylinders in the mist. You drift back through the days before the gas attack, moving along familiar stretches of trench where men had sensed a change long before they could articulate it. The front at Ypres had been restless for weeks, not in the way of heavy bombardments or infantry assaults, but in subtler, quieter ways. The kind of restlessness that creeps beneath the surface, the kind that soldiers feel in their bones before officers ever put words to it. It began with the cylinders. They appeared one morning as shapes glimpsed through periscopes and battered trench glasses, long metal tubes, half buried behind the German parapets. They sat in uneven rows, dark against the clay. At first, soldiers dismissed them as engineering stores or drainage equipment. Everything on this front was half rusted and half repurposed. Strange metal lying around was hardly worth comment. But the numbers grew. More cylinders, more careful arrangements, more hands working around them at dawn and dusk. From various corners of the Allied trenches, quiet observations drifted together, the Germans handling these objects with a strange deliberation, covering them with tarred cloths, adjusting hoses, checking valves. Some men whispered impressions that the cylinders looked too delicate, too intentionally placed to be ordinary battlefield debris. The rumors followed. From one trench to another, carried by tired voices over tins of tea, murmured during wiring parties, exchanged while cleaning mud from boots. Soldiers from the eastern fronts had spoken of strange experiments the previous year, clouds drifting over Russian positions, men choking without a single shot fired, entire sections of trench falling into silence under a strange, sharp-smelling mist. Most dismissed these tales at first. Every front carried its ghosts and exaggerations. But the presence of the cylinders made the rumors harder to ignore. You move along the duckboards as a few low, uneasy thoughts drift through the air, uncertain musings about what the Germans might be preparing, quiet speculation that something unusual is coming, half-formed remarks about how nothing about this war surprises anyone anymore. Even the weather took on a strange significance. Wind direction, normally an afterthought, became a matter of scrutiny. Officers began collecting reports, noting shifts in breezes with unusual care. Small blackboards were hung near dugout entrances listing daily wind readings, a detail that felt odd even before anyone understood why it mattered. You sensed the tension building like pressure under the soil. Some nights, men slept fitfully, waking with the uneasy sensation that something was watching them from across the darkened fields. Not an artillery battery, nor a sniper, but something more patient, more quiet, more deliberate. As the days passed, the metallic tang that occasionally drifted along the trenches became harder to ignore. It hovered lightly on the wind during still evenings, carrying the faintest sting, like the smell of cleaning fluid left too long in a closed room. Men sniffed the air, frowned, and dismissed it as some byproduct of German engineering work or decaying munitions. But each time it returned, it lingered a little longer. The officers felt it too. One morning, after a night of sporadic shelling, senior staff moved quietly along the line, speaking to one another in sharp whispers. Their expressions were tight. Their eyes kept wandering not to the horizon but to the wind, as if listening for something it might be carrying. You drift past a trench where a chaplain kneels beside a soldier patching a section of sandbag wall. The chaplain's voice is soft, reflective, offering comfort against an unnamed threat. His words ripple gently through the air, a reminder that sometimes dangers arrive in shapes the world has never seen before. The soldier nods but keeps glancing toward the German lines. Fear has not yet arrived, but anticipation has. The kind of anticipation that curls under the ribs, whispering that the ground beneath one's boots is shifting toward something completely unfamiliar. Something not made of iron or fire, but of breath and the unseen. And through it all, the cylinders wait. Silent, still, patient instruments for a weapon no one fully believes will ever be used. A breath the body recognizes before the mind does. The days pass with a kind of suspended tension, long stretches of muddy monotony strung together by a thread of quiet dread. The trenches hum with half-spoken questions, but no one yet has the language for what is coming. You drift through the front-line positions during a grey afternoon when the air seems heavier than usual. The sky hangs low and colourless, and the soldiers around you work with a subdued focus. They clean rifles already clean, tighten straps already tight, patch walls already patched. Their movements carry the rhythm of habit, but their eyes betray the feeling that routine is no longer enough. The wind continues shifting from the northeast. Each time it brushes across the trenches, shoulders tense. A few men pause mid-motion, tasting the air unconsciously. Someone murmurs that the breeze feels wrong, carrying with it a sharpness even water cannot rinse from the mouth. As evening settles in, you follow a small patrol returning from a forward sap. Their faces are pale, their steps quick. A few indistinct, breathless impressions reach you. The Germans working again around the cylinders, adjusting hoses in the dimming light, behaving with a precision that suggests a plan edging toward completion. One of the patrol members wipes his face with a trembling hand as he passes, the gesture heavy with an unspoken truth. Whatever is coming is no longer theoretical. You move toward the Colonial sector, where the French North African divisions keep uneasy watch over the wide expanse of fields. They, too, sense the shift. Weather charts have appeared near their dugouts, pinned hastily to rough wooden boards. The numbers are studied with far more seriousness than the soldiers are accustomed to giving meteorology. More and more, the air carries that faint smell, not strong enough to cause alarm, but present, insistent, wrong. It becomes clearer at dusk. As the last light fades, a wisp of strange vapor wafts from the German line, a thin thread rising then falling, like breath exhaled in cold weather. It disperses quickly, barely visible. But it is enough. Heads lift. Conversations stop. A chill deeper than temperature moves through the trench. You sense how the realization spreads through the ranks like a ripple. The cylinders weren't engineering stores. The hoses weren't drainage lines. The officer's interest in the wind wasn't curiosity. Something is coming. Something no one here has faced before. Night deepens. The breeze shifts again. And all along the front, men settle into uneasy sleep, their thoughts circling the presence of those dark shapes across no man's land. When morning arrives, it brings no clarity. Only more of the same stillness. More of the same heavy air. More of the same waiting. The waiting becomes its own kind of pressure, the sense that the front itself is holding a breath it cannot keep much longer. Even the birds avoid the fields now, their absence like an omen. A soldier nearby wipes his burning eyes, blaming smoke from a distant cook fire that hasn't existed for hours. Another coughs lightly, then shrugs it off with forced nonchalance. But the truth hovers between them. The body sometimes understands danger before the conscious mind does. And the wind keeps blowing the same direction. You drift along the trenches, moving past men who sense the moment coming closer, though none of them know what shape it will take when it arrives. Only that breath itself may soon change. Only that the world may soon tilt. Only that the cylinders across the field are not waiting idly. They are waiting for the wind. And the wind is already here. The First Breath, April 22nd, 1915. The day the first gas attack arrives does not feel like a day destined for the history books. It begins almost gently, wrapped in a pale, indifferent light that struggles to push through a ceiling of thin cloud. You drift along the trenches near Langemark, moving beside men who move with stiff, habitual motions. They tighten straps, scrape mud from boots, stir tea in dented tins. Nothing yet suggests the world is about to tilt. The artillery that opens the afternoon is familiar. Not the heavy, rolling drumfire of a planned assault, just the occasional concussion, a series of exploratory shells thudding into the rear areas. Soldiers glance up at each whistle, then return to their tasks. Fear has its rhythms here, and this pattern is one they know how to bear. But around 5 o'clock, the pattern breaks. The guns halt all at once, as if some unseen hand has pressed a palm over every muzzle along the German line. The sudden quiet feels wrong, not restful, not merciful, but deliberate. A silence waiting for something. You move toward the parapet, rising with the others as they peer over the churned, dark earth of no man's land. The German trenches lie still in the distance, their shapes low and unmoving. No rifles flash. No movement catches the eye. Then it begins. Thin streaks of vapor slip over the German parapets, drifting outward like fog with purpose. The first wisps are delicate, almost hesitant. Then more appear. Then more. Ribbons of pale air pooling together until the earth itself seems to exhale. The soldiers around you fall still. Someone nearby, voice low and uneasy, tries to rationalize the sight. Perhaps an early morning mist rising late, perhaps smoke from machinery behind their line. But the movement is wrong. Fog rises. This sinks. Fog scatters. This gathers. Fog vanishes under sunlight. This grows darker. Sickly color blooms inside the vapor. A yellowish tinge, then a deeper green, the color of old copper or rotting leaves pressed under standing water. It begins to move with the wind. A steady breeze brushes past you, and the cloud responds like a living thing, rolling forward across the field. You stay with the movement of the men, sensing how every breath around you grows slightly shallower. There are no orders, no shouts, only a tightening of posture along the line. The realization spreads without words. This is not weather. This is not smoke. This is something new. The colonial troops on your left, Algerian and Moroccan battalions, are the first to feel its weight. From where you hover, you can see them rise from their trenches, straining to understand the strange green tide sliding toward them. Officers motion urgently for cloths, for water, for anything that might cover a mouth or nose. A few soldiers dampen scarves and hold them close to their faces. The cloud reaches them before they are ready. It pours into their trenches like a low, creeping flood, spilling over sandbags and sinking into every depression. For a moment, their silhouettes freeze, stunned by the unreal sight of air turning hostile. Then the bodies fold. Coughing erupts in sharp, violent bursts. Some men fall to their knees as if struck. Others stagger along firing steps, clawing at their throats. A few try to scale the parapet to escape the deepening pool of poison settling in the trench floor. From your vantage, the scene looks dreamlike in its horror. Bright fezzes and blue coats blurred into the shimmering green haze. Men stumble in shapes distorted by tears and burning eyes. Some collapse in contorted stillness. Others grope blindly through the mist as their lungs betray them breath by breath. The gas flows onward. It moves with no more urgency than a tide sliding across sand. The wind guides it with a calm, merciless hand. Every shallow dip in the earth becomes a reservoir of death. Your own eyes begin to sting as the thinnest wisps reach the areas where you drift. The reaction is small, a prickling, a sharpness, but enough to send a warning into the deepest part of your awareness. This is danger that slips into the body with every breath. Around you, men press wet cloths desperately to their faces. Their hands shake. Their eyes blur. Their breaths turn short and shallow. Terror does not erupt. It thickens, a quiet panic settling like sediment inside the chest. You remain suspended among them as the cloud continues its slow, deliberate march. You feel the heaviness of the air, the way the world grows quiet, the way soldiers brace themselves against a threat they cannot touch or outpace. What moves toward you is not smoke, not fog, not anything the old world had words for. It is war reinventing itself, drifting, intimate, patient, and the first breath of it has arrived. When the line breaks open, the chaos that follows begins softly. A coughing fit here, a collapse there, small sounds swallowed by the thickening cloud. Then the suffering compounds. The French colonial trenches dissolve into a blur of bodies choking in synchrony. You hover above them as the scene widens into something the mind struggles to accept. Some soldiers stumble up ladders, reaching for cleaner air, only to be met by drifting tendrils of the same green vapor. Others collapse halfway up, sliding down the steps with limbs limp and useless. A few crawl across the parapet, eyes streaming so heavily they can barely see. Their movements are blind, desperate, and tragically brief. The gas deepens in the trench bottoms. Men sink into it as if into water, vanishing from sight as the green fog swallows their forms. Breaths become ragged, then wet, then silent. You drift across the sector as the collective shape of the colonial line begins to fail. Not from fear, not from any decision to retreat, but from the simple impossibility of standing upright when the lungs themselves are under attack. A handful of survivors attempt to flee. Some stagger into open ground, hands reaching out as though searching for invisible anchors. Others collapse mere steps from safety, bodies folding inward with quiet finality. The collapse spreads sideways like a tear ripping through fabric. Across hundreds of yards, The trenches grow quiet. Shapes slump against sandbags. Gear lies abandoned in the mud. The entire sector becomes an empty, gas-sickened wound. The Germans appear through the haze shortly after, grey figures rising from their lines in cautious, staggered waves. They advance slowly, moving behind the cloud as if using it as a shield. Rags are tied across their faces. Their steps are careful, deliberate. They do not need to fire. The field has been cleared for them. Their silhouettes spread out into the vacant colonial trenches, probing the damage, stepping over bodies left in unnatural positions. Their movements confirm what the front already understands. The line has not bent. It has not wavered. It has been erased. You move toward the surviving Allied sectors, where soldiers strain to see through the thinning haze. Their breaths rattle through wet cloths. Their lungs ache. Their eyes burn. But they remain standing. They remain watching. What they see is terrifying. An entire flank opened like a door. The void stretches across the battlefield, an absence so large it reshapes the ground. Officers gesture urgently for units to shift left, to bend themselves into a new formation. Canadian and British companies stretch thin, trying to occupy space that once held thousands. Even from where you hover, you sense the futility. The gap is too wide. The survivors too few. The gas too effective. The Germans press forward, using the vacuum like a corridor. And as you drift between the living and the dying, you feel something deeper than fear settle into the air. The old shape of war has been broken. Something new has entered the world. Something that rides the wind. Something that pools in the earth. Something that kills without a single bullet fired. A new chapter of warfare has begun, and it began with a single breath. The line breaks open, French colonial troops in the green tide. You drift back toward the colonial sector, where the gas has settled deepest. Here, the land lies a little lower, the trenches cut into ground that seemed harmless when they were first dug. Now that same low ground has become a basin for chlorine. From above, the trenches look like dark cuts filled with moving light, greenish, shimmering, flickering where the cloud thickens and thins. Within them, the French North African soldiers are still moving, still struggling, but their efforts are already being slowly drowned. At first they tried to hold, as soldiers always do. You can almost feel the instinct that drives them, the ingrained urge to brace against any assault, to cling to the line even when the earth shakes and the sky burns. Impressions linger in the air of hurried efforts to adapt, cloths dragged from pockets, scarves soaked in canteen water, uniforms pressed against faces to strain the air. For a brief, fragile moment, the front seems to resist. But chlorine is indifferent to courage. It sinks into every low inch of trench, filling it from the bottom up. The gas collects around boots and ankles, then climbs to chests and faces. It curls through dugout entrances, spilling into once safe recesses beneath the earth. It seeks out lungs as if they were its destination all along. You hover close enough to see the change in their bodies. Some of the men bend double, their chests convulsing. Others drop to their knees and press their faces into the crooks of their elbows, trying to find some pocket of untainted air. A few rake their fingers down their throats, as though they might physically tear the burning sensation free. Eyes redden and swell. Breaths shorten and quicken. Voices crack into broken sounds that barely resemble speech. The trench, once a place of cover, becomes a trap. A few soldiers scramble upward, climbing onto fire steps and parapets to escape the deepening cloud below. From above, they find only thinner wisps of poison carried by the wind. They stand there for a few seconds, coughing, blinking against the unnatural brightness of the gaslit field. Then many of them crumble and slide back down into the very space they tried to escape. The line begins to tear. Not because the men decide to run, but because their bodies can no longer answer the command to stand. Some collapse where they are, fingers locked around rifle stocks that no longer matter. Others stumble forward a few steps and fall across sandbags or into communication trenches, their limbs twisted into frozen gestures of movement interrupted. A few, propelled by instinct alone, stagger out of the trench and into the open, moving blindly through the green-tinged light as their lungs seize inside them. The sight of it feels unreal, not quite like battle, not quite like anything the old stories of war prepared anyone to understand. There is no dramatic clash here, no visible impact, no rush of steel on flesh. Just air becoming lethal, slowly and completely. As more soldiers collapse, the positions they once held fall quiet. You drift along the length of the sector and sense the shape of the front changing beneath you. Where there should be a continuous line of defenders, there is now a thinning thread, then isolated pockets of movement, then finally stretches of trench where no one stands at all. The Colonial battalions have not abandoned their posts. Their posts have been torn away from them. In some dugouts, a few men still cling to life, sitting slumped against dirt walls, heads tilted back, mouths open as they fight for each breath. In others, the gas has done its work completely. The silence there is not empty. It is thick, almost tangible, filled with the residue of what just happened. The more you move along this sector, the more the pattern becomes clear. The line is no longer a line. It is a series of broken fragments, slowly sinking into a green tide. Chaos, retreat, and the long gap. As the gas thins slightly and the worst of the cloud begins to drift onward, the shape of the catastrophe becomes stark. From where you hover above the battlefield, you can see the Colonial trenches stretching away in both directions, but whole sections of them no longer move. No hands lift rifles. No figures rise to peer over the parapet. No signals flash. The positions still exist on paper, on maps, in the minds of the officers, but on the ground they have turned into something else, a corridor of death. Word of the collapse spreads outward through channels of instinct as much as communication. Nearby units feel it first. A change in sound, a shift in pressure, the absence where there should be supporting fire. Hints drift along the trenches, impressions of men fleeing blindly from the gas, of positions consumed in minutes, of an entire sector swallowed by air gone bad. The details are unclear, but the message is unmistakable. The left has given way. You drift nearer the boundary between the intact lines and the ruined sector. The contrast hits hard. In one direction, trenches still occupied, soldiers coughing through damp cloths, eyes inflamed but bodies upright, rifles steadying on sandbags. In the other, emptiness broken only by still shapes and faintly swirling green. The void widens across hundreds of yards. It is not a small gap that might be bridged by a hurried company or two. It is a yawning space where once there were thousands of men. It does not look like a tactical setback. It looks like a piece of the front has simply been erased. And the Germans see it. Through the thinning haze, you watch grey figures rise from their own trenches in growing numbers. They advance cautiously at first, feeling their way into a battlefield that has been altered in their favor. Cloths and crude masks cover their faces. They move in irregular waves, stepping carefully over bodies and equipment as they test the silence ahead of them. There is little to test. They find abandoned rifles still leaning against firing steps, packs half opened and then forgotten, spilled cartridges scattered across the mud, blankets thrown aside in haste. They also find the men who never made it out, sprawled on duckboards, slumped against trench walls, lying in shell holes with hands still reaching for the surface. The invaders pick their way through this grim landscape, checking for signs of life, prodding cautiously at dugout entrances, then pressing forward. You sense the change in their energy as realization settles in. The Colonial front is not just weakened, it is gone. They begin to fan out, following the empty trenches like paths, moving closer to the unbroken Allied sectors still holding on either side. They are not charging yet. This is not the wild rush of a bayonet assault. It is something slower, deeper, more deliberate. An army stepping into a door that has been opened for it. Behind the intact Allied lines, officers scramble to react. You drift among them as they lean over hastily unrolled maps, fingers tracing the shape of the new gap. Messages arrive in short bursts from the surviving pockets of the Colonial divisions. The fragments of information are enough to confirm what the eyes already know. A vast section of the front no longer exists as a fighting force. Nearby units are ordered to stretch themselves thin. Canadians shift left, lengthening their frontage beyond anything it was designed to hold. British battalions bend around the exposed edge like cloth being pulled too far across a table. The line tries to reassemble itself into a new shape, as if muscle and will alone can cover the wound. You move with the repositioning, sensing the exhaustion beneath their resolve. These soldiers are still coughing from the lesser concentrations of gas that reached them. Their throats burn. Their lungs ache. Yet now they must act as the makeshift hinge between what has collapsed and what remains. The gap, though, is wider than their capacity to fill it. Between the stretched Canadian and British positions and what once was the Colonial front lies an expanse of loosened earth and poisoned air that cannot simply be wished away. It is there on every map now, a hollow in the line, and through that hollow, German troops are beginning to flow. From your vantage above the field, you see it all at once. Intact trenches holding on through coughing breaths. A shattered sector lying quiet, bathed in fading green. Grey figures advancing into the vacuum. Allied troops bending, stretching, trying not to break. What began as a cloud has become a gap. What began as an experiment has become an opening. And somewhere inside that opening, the shape of this battle, and the war itself, has shifted for good. Field hospitals overrun. Improvisation in a new kind of war. You drift toward the rear, carried along the same wind that pushed the gas forward, as the first survivors begin stumbling out of the green-lit sector. They do not come in lines or units. They come as fragments, lone figures, pairs, small clusters moving as though in a dream from which they cannot wake. Some walk crookedly, shoulders hunched, hands pressed to chests. Others stagger into ditches, unable to rise. A few crawl with slow, jerking motions, their bodies confused by the absence of clean air. The medics waiting for them were trained for shrapnel wounds and bullet strikes, not this. Still, they rush toward the incoming wave of suffering, though their steps falter with uncertainty. The kits they carry feel suddenly strange in their hands, tools for old wounds in a war that has just shifted beneath their feet. The first man they reach is on his knees, torso bowing forward with every breath. A medic steadies him, trying to guide him upright, but the man's lungs flutter in shallow bursts. Foam collects at the corners of his mouth, pale and shimmering against the afternoon light. The medic reaches for water, wets a cloth, presses it gently over the man's face. The relief lasts only a moment. The next breath pulls the pain back inside. You float closer as more men arrive. Some have eyes swollen nearly shut, vision blurred by burning tears. Some hold cloths to their mouths, hands trembling so violently they can barely keep them in place. Others sit slumped against fence posts or the sides of ambulances, staring at the ground as though trying to comprehend the sensation of drowning without water. A French officer collapses onto a stretcher, chest heaving in uneven waves. A faint, broken attempt at speech escapes him, an effort to express that air has become impossible, but the sound dissolves into a thin whistle. The medics lift him quickly and carry him toward the nearest medical tent. It is already full. Inside, the air feels thick, humid with sweat and antiseptic, and the faint scent of chlorine clinging stubbornly to uniforms. Doctors move from cot to cot, sleeves rolled high, faces tight with helpless fatigue. They examine throats raw from gas, skin tinged with a sickly grey-green, eyes swollen, lungs betraying their own bodies. There are no remedies here. Only guesses. Only improvisations. In one corner, a doctor instructs nurses to apply water-soaked cloths, though he admits quietly that the relief is limited. Nearby, a stretcher-bearer fans a man whose breaths come in wet rattles, as if each inhale scrapes the inside of his chest. Another medic kneels beside a soldier whose hands tremble uncontrollably as he tries to sit up. The medic gently lowers him back onto the cot, knowing motion will only worsen the struggle for air. Outside the tent, the overflow begins. Soldiers sit on crates, on overturned helmets, on the ground. They lean against one another for support. Their breathing comes in ragged bursts, some shallow, others panicked and deep. From the edges of the cluster, whispered impressions float through the air, men muttering that their lungs burn as though aflame, others rasping faint words about a strange taste on the wind. A few clutch their chests with white-knuckled hands, each breath an act of will. The line of casualties lengthens too quickly for the medical staff to comprehend. Stretcher after stretcher arrives, carried by boys who look both exhausted and bewildered. They set the wounded down with care, then turn back toward the battlefield because there are more coming, always more coming. A nurse passes you, face streaked with grime and sweat, her eyes glassy with shock. She pauses beside a soldier convulsing on the ground, trying to push a cloth over his mouth. His hands bat it away in blind panic. She steadies him, presses the cloth more firmly, whispers something soothing. His breathing slows, not from relief, but from the body's gradual surrender. The scene grows heavier with each moment. Medicine is being asked to speak a language it does not yet know, and the suffering keeps arriving, untranslatable, unstoppable. When the hospitals drown in suffering. You drift among the tents as the afternoon deepens into a bruised, uneasy light. The medical stations have become a tide pool of human agony, each new wave of wounded arriving before the last can be tended to. The field was never meant to hold so many lungs gasping at once. At the entrance of one tent, an officer attempts to organize the chaos. His voice is hoarse, barely audible above the constant coughing. He gestures toward different groups, those who can walk, those who must be carried, those whose breaths are fading too quickly for any intervention. His movements are sharp, practiced, but beneath them lies a deep, shaking fatigue. Inside, the tent is an orchestra of suffering. Cots line both sides, filled with men whose bodies tremble with each breath. The smell of antiseptic mixes with sweat, mud, and a faint, lingering sting of chlorine. A doctor bends over a man whose breathing sounds like water being drawn through a narrow pipe. He listens with a stethoscope, then wipes his forehead with a cloth that's already damp with too many other tasks. A nurse approaches, eyes full of a question she fears she already knows the answer to. The doctor's brief, quiet nod is enough. The man is shifted to the side of the tent where the morphine is administered. His breaths soften. His body stills. You move past another cot where a young rifleman sits hunched forward, elbows on knees, trying to draw air into lungs that feel too small. His face is pale except for the reddened rims of his eyes. A medic kneels beside him, guiding his breathing in slow, patient gestures, as though trying to calm a storm using nothing but his hands. At the far end of the tent, Two stretcher-bearers carry in another body, limp, head lolling. They set him down gently. The doctor only places a hand on the man's chest, waits a moment, then moves on. The stretcher-bearers cover the body and carry him outside, joining a quiet line forming along the perimeter. Under the fading light, the blankets covering these still forms ripple lightly with the wind, the only movement left to give them. Outside the tents, the corridor of casualties expands. Some men sit curled forward, heads between their knees. Others sit upright with backs against tree trunks or carts, their faces slack with exhaustion but still fighting for breath. A few murmur fractured memories from the trench, fragments of confusion, of burning air, of a cloud that moved like a living tide. The field becomes a landscape of quiet desperation. Nurses move quickly, dipping cloths into buckets, pressing them over mouths, offering sips of water with careful hands. The smell of urine-soaked rags rises occasionally, an improvised method whispered among medics as a possible shield, though it feels more like hope than science. As night begins to settle, lanterns are lit one by one, their flickering glow casting long shadows over slumped forms and hurrying silhouettes. The light reflects off tears, off sweat, off eyes staring at nothing as the body fights its final fight. You float above this scene, seeing the whole shape of it. Medicine, pushed beyond its limits. Soldiers, broken not by bullets but by breath. A new weapon, rewriting the rules of war in a single afternoon. The gas has not only torn a hole in the front, it has torn a hole in the world, a place where the old logic of battle no longer applies, where even the healers cannot keep pace with the wounds inflicted by air. And as the field hospitals drown in this new kind of suffering, a quiet truth settles over the tents like falling dusk. The war has changed, and the world will not return to what it was before the wind turned green. Civilians in a gas war. The wind reaches the villages. The battlefield is not the only place touched by the green cloud. As the afternoon wanes, you drift beyond the trenches, across the roads and fields that lead towards scattered homes and farmsteads. The land here once belonged to quiet routines, ploughing, feeding livestock, mending roofs, watching the weather for signs of rain or frost. Now the weather brings something else entirely. The same wind that pushed Chlorine into trenches continues onward, carrying with it traces of what has happened at the front. The cloud spreads thinner here, breaking into faint ribbons, wisps that barely register as color at first. Only when they brush the edges of houses, windowsills, door frames, low stone walls, does their shape become clear enough to fear. From your place above the fields, you sense the moment villagers realize something is wrong. A farmer stands at the edge of his pasture, hands braced against a fence post, staring toward the distant battlefield. At first he watches only the sky, the strange tint hanging low over the line, but then he lowers his gaze to the ground and sees a creeping pallor sliding toward him. His breath catches, not yet in pain but in instinct. A few meters away, two children stop playing in the yard. One lifts her face to the wind, squinting as though sensing a sharpness hidden inside it. Their mother emerges from the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron, puzzled by the sudden stillness in her children's expressions. A faint sting enters their eyes. It isn't strong enough to burn, but it is strong enough to terrify. You drift closer as the mother gathers the children, urging them inside with a hurried gesture. Her footsteps quicken. The youngest begins coughing, not violently, just enough to deepen the mother's fear. She pushes the door shut, sealing the house as if the wooden panels could keep out something as small and pervasive as poisoned air. A neighbor across the lane has already understood more deeply. He wets a cloth and presses it to his face, lifting a bucket of water to dampen more rags. His voice carries through an open window, telling his family to stay away from the lower rooms, to move upstairs, to avoid any place where the air feels heavy. Civilians know the shape of danger when they see it, even if they do not yet have a word for chlorine. As the cloud thins further, it pools in low spots along the road. Shallow ditches, stagnant puddles, cellar windows set too close to the ground. A dog whimpers and backs away, nose lifted high, unwilling to go near the strange-smelling air. Birds abandon their roosts, flapping hard toward clearer sky. In one farmhouse, a family attempts to block the lower windows with cloths. The father pushes rags firmly into gaps between frame and stone, while the mother carries buckets of water back and forth to dampen them again. Their motions are frantic, improvisational, guided by half-heard advice and desperate guesswork. You move through the house with them. The air is warm, heavy with breath and fear. The children sit on the stairs, wide-eyed, clutching blankets around their shoulders. Every few minutes, the father checks the windowsill to see if the faint green tinge has thickened. His fingers tremble as he touches the damp cloth, as though expecting it to burn his skin. Outside, the cloud keeps drifting, thinner now, but still wrong, still heavy, still carrying echoes of what it did to men in trenches only hours ago. And across the village, whispered impressions float from houses and farmyards. Fears about the strange light clinging to the ground, uncertainty about whether to flee or hide. Quiet prayers as parents press their children closer, hoping walls and water can hold the danger at bay. War was always expected to come from the guns ahead. No one imagined it might come from the wind. Homes turn into traps. As evening approaches, the air cools, and with the cooling, the gas settles even more deeply into low-lying places. What was an invisible threat for soldiers becomes a creeping, visible presence for the families scattered along the Ypres roads. You drift toward a row of cottages built close to the ground. Their cellar windows sit barely a foot above the soil, perfect openings for the sinking chlorine. Inside, a family crouches in the kitchen, trying to stay in the higher half of the house. The father keeps a bucket nearby, dipping cloths again and again to lay across the threshold. He never imagined his home could need defending from air. Another home a short distance away holds a mother and her aging parents. They sit near an open stairwell that leads to a loft, unwilling to descend. Their breaths are shallow, their faces pale. Beneath the floorboards, a basement door rattles gently on its hinges, pushed by currents of cold air pooling in the lower rooms. It is impossible not to feel the dread rising with that sound. Farther down the lane, a man tries to lead his horse out of the stable. The animal refuses to cross a thin line of greenish vapor near the ground. Its ears flatten. Its hooves scrape backward. The man pulls harder, his anxiety rising, until he finally abandons the effort and retreats indoors, leaving the stable door ajar behind him. You drift through a barn where a few chickens lie still, their forms silhouetted by late sunlight slipping through cracks in the boards. The farmer kneels beside them, confusion etched into his features. He cannot understand what has killed them so quickly. He presses a cloth to his face as his breathing sharpens into fear. In the village square, a group of civilians gather with buckets, cloths, and blankets. They press wet rags to their faces, glancing constantly toward the distant horizon where the strange green glow lingers. Some exchange short, trembling impressions about what they saw on the road. Soldiers coughing into rags, officers shouting warnings without clarity, stretcher-bearers moving men who could no longer stand. Rumors ripple through the crowd, talk of lungs collapsing, of men choking in trenches, of a new weapon that moves with the wind. No one knows how much is true. No one knows how much is exaggeration. But the fear in their voices carries the same weight as fact. Children cling to their parents' coats. Elders clutch handkerchiefs to their faces. The entire community waits for the air to clear. But the air does not obey them. In one cottage, a mother cracks open a window upstairs to test the breeze. She inhales gently, searching for the sting. Her expression tightens. She closes the window quickly and pulls her children further into the loft. Beneath them, a patch of the floorboards glows faintly in the fading light, a reminder of what pools below. Another family attempts to flee toward higher ground, but the road is lined with thin, lingering wisps of chlorine. Their steps slow. They retreat back into the house, no safer than before. You drift between these homes, feeling the helplessness gather like a second, quieter fog. Civilians have no masks, no drills, no warnings, no guidance beyond instinct and fear. Their only protection is height, wet cloth, and hope. As the night deepens, lanterns flicker in windows across the valley. People rest where the air feels clearest, on staircases, lofts, attics, even tabletop surfaces pulled close together. Every breath is cautious. Every sound from the ground floor is ominous. You sense the same truth in every home. The gas has made the front porous. It has slipped past the trenches, past the soldiers, past the boundaries of battle. It has entered the lives of people who never imagined the war could reach them like this. And as the quiet hours stretch on, one realization settles heavily into the dark. When the air itself betrays you, there is nowhere left to run. The counterattack. Canadians in the breach. You drift back toward the front as the afternoon leans toward evening, drawn to the place where the gap in the line threatens to swallow everything around it. The Colonial sector lies behind you now, hollow and quiet beneath the fading presence of chlorine. Ahead, the surviving Allied trenches tense like muscles bracing for another blow. It is in this strained silence that the Canadians take their place. They have watched the collapse unfold from a distance, seen the green fog swallow the Colonial lines, seen grey figures moving through the empty trenches, seen the map of the front lose a piece of itself. Now they are being asked to step into that absence, to stand where others have been erased. You hover above them as they shift position. Their uniforms are smeared with the same Flanders mud, their shoulders bowed with the same weariness as every other unit on this front. Some cough into damp cloths, throats raw from stray gas that drifted their way earlier in the day. Others rub burning eyes with knuckles stained by soil and cordite. Orders move along the trenches like a current. Extend here, bend there, connect to what is left of the Colonial flank, seal the edge of the void as best as human bodies can. The men know what this truly means, even if the words stay formal. They are being asked to become a wall where there is no longer a foundation. You follow them as they move through communication trenches, over planks laid hastily across waterlogged ditches, past positions still haunted by the scent of chlorine. The earth is pocked with footprints of men who fled or were carried out only hours ago. Every step brings them closer to ground that still holds the memory of gas. By the time they reach their new positions, the air is clearer but not entirely clean. The faint tang remains. The eye still stings near certain hollows. They take their places anyway. Rifles are checked with the calm of routine. Bayonets are fixed with the quiet finality of men who understand what that steel really means. Faces lift toward the horizon, where German shapes are beginning to gather in the distance. You can feel the mixture in the air around them, not courage alone, and certainly not absence of fear. Something more complicated, a grim acceptance that there is nowhere else to stand. Behind these trenches lie field hospitals already overflowing, roads clogged with the wounded, villages holding their breath, and a town called Ypres that has already endured too much. If the line breaks here, the road to that town opens. The Canadians know this without needing speeches or slogans. It is simply the truth of the ground beneath their boots. In the distance, German artillery begins again. Not the exploratory shells of earlier, but a more deliberate probing, testing these newly formed defenses, feeling for weakness. The shells fall with dull, thudding impacts, throwing up gouts of mud and splinters. The trenches shake. Dirt sprinkles down from overhead ledges. Men press themselves closer to the walls, eyes clenched tight for the moment between sound and impact. The ground settles, then trembles again. You hover above the incoming fire, sensing the strange double-layered threat of this new front, the visible shrapnel that tears bodies, and the invisible memory of gas that still hangs in every breath. The men here must face both, and do it knowing that others have fallen to a weapon they cannot shoot back at. Word filters down the trench in fragments. The Germans are massing near the gap. They intend to exploit the opening. They will likely swing around rather than attack head-on. The Canadians are now the hinge between survival and unraveling. They tighten their grips on their rifles. They adjust their bayonets once more. They wait. Waiting becomes its own form of combat. Breaths slow. Thoughts narrow. The future shrinks to the few yards of mud directly ahead. Even as shells continue to fall, the fading green stain on the horizon remains visible, a reminder of what preceded this moment. The men standing here have not just stepped into a breach. They have stepped into the aftermath of a crime the world has not yet named. And soon, they will have to move forward into it. Bayonets through a fading cloud. As evening sinks further, the air over the newest Canadian-held sector grows darker, but not calmer. The German artillery slackens for a brief, unnerving interval, not from mercy, but to clear the way. The lull hangs over the trenches like a held breath. You drift above the parapets, feeling the pressure build. Somewhere beyond the fading gas, grey ranks are forming. The men in these trenches know it without seeing them. The order to prepare rolls down the line. Bayonets catch the dim light as they rise in ragged unison. Rifles are cradled more tightly in gloved or mud-streaked hands. Feet reposition along fire steps, each man carving out a small patch of earth to defend with everything left inside him. The ground directly in front of them is a patchwork of horrors. Colonial trenches half filled with bodies and residue of green. Shell holes dark with water reflecting the cursed sky. Earth still marked by footprints of those who tried to flee. Into this, the Canadians stare and ready themselves. The Germans come at last as shifting shapes along the horizon, lines that thicken as they advance. Their movement is more cautious than in older battles. They know gas has not spared every patch of ground. Crude masks and makeshift face covers remain in place for some, while others move more freely, trusting that the worst of the chlorine has thinned. From where you hover, you watch the moment when the distance between the two sides becomes fragile. Rifle fire cracks out from the Canadian trenches, sharp and measured. There is no reckless volley, no waste. Every shot is deliberate, guided by the knowledge that ammunition, like breath, must be spent carefully. Some of the advancing Germans fall, their bodies folding into the very mud cleared for them by the earlier cloud. Others press on, stepping over their fallen with grim momentum. The ground between the lines becomes a storm of movement and impact. Bullets tear through the air in invisible arcs. Shrapnel shrieks from late-falling shells. Voices rise and break, then dissolve into the roar. The gas hangs as a ghost in the background, thinner now, fragmenting but still present. In certain dips in the earth, men who fall do not rise again, even when their wounds seem slight. Their lungs meet what their eyes can no longer see. At a certain point, the distance narrows too far for rifles alone to hold. The command to counterattack moves along the Canadian line like a dark wave. There is no shouted bravado, no rallying cry that tries to dress the moment in heroism. Just a heavy, resigned force. Men climbing out of their trenches not because they believe in glory, but because they understand that sometimes the only way to hold a line is to step into the open and push back. You rise higher as they go over the top. They advance in grim clusters across ground that still remembers chlorine. Their boots slosh through shallow pockets of water, reflecting the sky's bruised colors. Some cough as they run, lungs not yet fully recovered from the earlier wisps of gas. Their bayonets catch the last of the light, thin and cold. The Canadians meet the German advance in this poisoned, broken space. There is no clear, cinematic moment of collision, just a chaos of forms, close and brutal. Men grapple in shell holes half filled with tainted water. Bayonets thrust and are met with flesh, with cloth, with the unyielding resistance of another human being who also does not want to fall here. Rifle stocks swing. Boots slip on mud and worse. The air is full of panting, grunting, the sickening dull sounds of struck bone and metal dragged across bodies. You drift above, witnessing not a heroic tableau but an act of stubborn refusal. Refusal to yield this ground. Refusal to let the gap become a floodgate. Refusal to let the green tide dictate the shape of the front entirely. Some Canadians push forward into the shattered remains of the Colonial trenches, trying to reclaim even a few yards. They find pockets of German troops who had already begun to occupy these positions. Close fighting breaks out in cramped spaces still smelling of gas and fear. Every breath is a negotiation between exertion and the lingering sting of chlorine. The cost becomes apparent far too quickly. Men fall in droves, some to bullets, some to blades, some to the unseen remnants of the gas lingering in low hollows. Bodies lie at angles that tell stories of motion interrupted. A step half taken, an arm halfway raised, a lunge frozen before completion. From above, you can see that the counterattack does not sweep the enemy away. It dents them. It halts them. It slows their exploitation of the gap. It does not erase the catastrophe that created the need for it. As the fighting grinds into exhaustion, the lines stabilize into a new, jagged shape. The Canadians hold, not in pristine formation, not shoulder to shoulder in unmarred ranks, but in a shattered, bleeding layer of bodies along the contested ground. Night begins to lay its dark cloth over the battlefield. The gas fades further into memory, though its effects remain in every cough, in every burning eye, in every body lying unnaturally still across the broken fields. The Canadians, or what remains of them, dig in where they have managed to stand their ground. The front has bent, twisted, contorted, but it has not entirely snapped. You hover above it all, sensing the heavy truth. This was not a victory. It was a holding, a refusal, a line of men deciding that if they must fall, they will fall facing the direction from which the wind came. In the dark, the battlefield quiets, but the shape of what happened here will not. The war has seen its first great chemical attack. The men who lived through this counterattack carry that knowledge in their lungs, and the wind remembers the path it took. What it means to fear the wind, a new instinct. The battlefield has begun to settle, but the men have not. You drift along the ragged trenches where the Canadians, British, French, and Colonial remnants cling to whatever shape the front has taken after the gas attack. The ground is uneven now, not just physically, but mentally. Even the earth seems uncertain of itself, as though it hasn't yet understood what kind of war it is part of. The first thing you notice is how often the soldiers look at the sky, not at clouds or birds or enemy aircraft, but at the direction of the wind. It has become a kind of reflex, a new instinct pressed into them by the afternoon when breath became weapon. Men who once watched only for snipers or shells now pause in the middle of tying a bootlace to feel the breeze on their cheeks. They lift wet fingers to the air, gauging the drift with the seriousness of a surgeon's hand. You hover above a group repairing their parapet. Their movements are steady but subdued. Every few minutes, one of them stops, turns his head slightly, and tests the air with a slow inhale that ends in a wary hesitation. The others follow suit without discussion, as though the wind has become a drill seared into their nerves. Nearby, a few soldiers place small scraps of cloth on sticks, tying them loosely so they flutter even under the faintest movement of air. They watch these makeshift indicators the way artillery observers might watch the fall of their shells, with an intensity that leaves little room for anything else. One of them murmurs a soft impression about the breeze feeling lighter today, not carrying the sharp tang it did before. Another responds that the smell can change, that poison does not always announce itself. Their voices blend into the ambient hum of the trench. This is the new reality. Men terrified not of thunder or fire, but of a gentle, drifting wind. At dusk, as they prepare for another long night, a small group gathers near a dugout where a chalkboard lists the day's wind readings. It leans against a sandbagged wall, smudged and hastily updated, the numbers stark and urgent. Direction, speed, variability. A corporal taps the board and speaks in a low, steady tone about staying alert for shifts. No drama surrounds his words. No alarm. Just a quiet certainty that everyone nods to as though he is describing where to aim their rifles or when to expect the next ration cart. You drift among them, feeling how the old fears, the clean, sharp fears of bullets and shrapnel, have not disappeared but have been overshadowed by a new one. This fear does not make them duck or sprint or brace. It makes them pause. It makes them breathe carefully. It makes them check the air before lifting their heads above the parapet. The wind has become part of their enemy. Even the night watch has changed. Sentinels who once scanned the horizon for flares and shadowy forms now keep one eye on the tattered cloth flapping above their heads. If it stirs in a strange direction, if the breeze feels heavier, if the scent grows unfamiliar, the entire trench shifts into a quiet, urgent readiness. And all the while, the memory of the green cloud hangs in the air like smoke from a fire that has burned out but left its scent behind. The soldiers carry that memory in their lungs, coughs lingering, breaths coming shorter than before. The gas has not only taken lives, it has taken the very trust they once placed in the air around them. This is what it means to fear the wind. Not panic, not trembling, but a constant, low-level vigilance, a knowledge that something invisible and patient has entered the world, and will return whenever the breeze decides to bring it. Drills for an unseen enemy. As you drift through the forward positions in the following days, you see the new habits forming with unsettling speed. The officers recognize that the world has changed, and the drills change with it. No manual has been written yet. No proper equipment has been issued. But improvisation becomes doctrine. Soldiers wet whatever cloth they have, scarves, socks, strips of shirt, dipping them into water barrels or canteens. They keep them close at hand, draped over shoulders, stuffed into pockets, tied around necks ready to be pulled up at a moment's notice. The cloths become as essential as rifles. Medics and stretcher-bearers share hurried advice about urine-soaked rags, passing along the crude chemistry as though it were official training. The idea spreads quickly, half desperate, half scientific, powered by the memory of what half measures looked like when the gas struck unannounced. You hover above the trenches as new routines emerge. Men test their cloths for dampness before sleeping, as though checking the safety of a lantern wick. They stack sandbags at odd angles, creating pockets of higher air. They leave dugouts cracked open to avoid becoming sealed traps. They dig shallow steps leading upward, not downward, a reversal of everything trench design once assumed. Every movement carries a quiet, anxious purpose. In one trench, a sergeant demonstrates how to recognize the early warning signs of gas. He uses gestures more than words, pointing toward the horizon, the surface of puddles, the way vapor moves unnaturally close to the ground. His audience watches him with rapt attention, their faces sober. These are not theoretical lessons. These are instructions for staying alive in a new landscape. You drift past men practicing the act of breathing through cloths. Slow inhales, slow exhales. They look like monks preparing for prayer, except the object of devotion is survival. New masks begin to appear, crudely made from gauze, flannel, and wire mesh. The first models come from improvised workshops behind the lines, simple pads soaked in chemicals meant to neutralize chlorine. They are uncomfortable, damp, and difficult to breathe through, but they are better than nothing. And better than nothing has become a measure worth respecting. The soldiers accept these makeshift masks with the same stoic endurance they give to rations and orders. They test the straps, adjust the fit, sniff the air inside them. Some cough, some grimace, some try to laugh but find the humor too thin to hold. You float above as the first mask drills begin. A whistle sounds. Men lift their masks to their faces. Another whistle. Masks off. Again. 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 No one wants to be the man who fumbles when the next cloud comes. Somewhere along the line, a faint impression drifts through the trench, a muttered thought about how strange it is to train for the air, to defend against something that cannot be seen until it is too late. Another voice responds quietly, suggesting that this is the new war, whether any of them understand it or not. Their words, though soft, settle in the minds of everyone nearby. At night, the drills continue. The cloth indicators flutter in the darkness. Breath becomes a measured, deliberate act. And every soldier knows that the next attack will not sound like a barrage or a charge. It will sound like silence. It will move like mist. It will arrive in the space between heartbeats. You drift above them as the realization spreads through every dugout, every parapet, every weary lung. They have learned to fear the wind. Now they must learn to fight it. Shellfire in a sickly light, when shells begin to breathe. The first gas cloud came from cylinders and wind. The next phase arrives inside metal. You drift along the line weeks later, when the horror of that first green tide has not faded but begun to calcify into memory. Men still cough in the night. They still check the wind with small, nervous gestures. But a dull, wary routine has begun to form around the fear. It is in this fragile new normal that the artillery changes. At first, the shells sound the same. You hover above the front as German guns open fire in the familiar rhythm. The distant boom, the high whistling arc, the sudden concussion as earth erupts in muddy fountains. Men duck, brace, curse under their breath in all the usual ways. The trenches tremble. Clods of dirt rain down from overhead ledges. Nothing about it feels new. Then the air shifts. In the wake of one explosion, a strange haze rises from the crater, thicker than ordinary smoke, heavier, clinging close to the ground. The color of it catches uneasily at the eye. Not pure gray, not white, but a pale, diluted yellow-green that seems almost ashamed of itself. You drift closer and feel the old, unwelcome sting in the air. It is weaker than the great cloud from the cylinders, but its nature is the same. The gas crawls out of the shattered earth as if the shell has become a delivery system for breath turned lethal. It rolls along the bottom of the crater, then drifts over its lip, searching for lower places to settle. Men nearby stiffen. They have learned now to look for the signs. The way the smoke hugs the ground, the way puddles ripple with an oily shimmer, the way the throat tingles before the mind registers danger. Masks and cloths rise to faces faster than before. A few hearts still skip a beat in delayed recognition, But the reaction is no longer confusion. It is practiced fear. The shelling continues, and with it, more of the strange smoke. Not every shell carries gas, but enough of them do to blur the difference. The men begin to realize that they cannot trust sight alone to distinguish one explosion from another. Ground that would once have been used for immediate cover now becomes suspect. Craters turn into traps. You drift from trench to trench, feeling the subtle change in the atmosphere. Before, the gas had been a singular horror, one vast event that swept across fields like an unnatural tide. Now it becomes something more insidious, woven into the daily fabric of bombardment. It is no longer a rare assault, but a possibility hidden inside every blast of earth. Soldiers adjust their behavior in small, telling ways. They hesitate before leaping into fresh craters for shelter. They peer through thinning smoke, watching how it moves. They keep masks and damp cloths within arm's reach even when no cloud is visible. Orders circulate that any unusual smoke after a shell burst must be treated as gas. It is better to waste caution than breath. The sky over Ypres takes on a new character in these days. Shellfire tears it open again and again, each impact sending up plumes that briefly veil the sun. Sometimes the light filters through the lingering haze in a way that tints the world with a faint, unhealthy glow, as though the day itself carries a bruise. You sense how this seeps into the men's thoughts. They no longer think of gas as a single event. They think of it as a presence, intermittent, unpredictable, forever lurking at the edges of every bombardment. The shells have learned to breathe, and the war has gained yet another layer of poison. Night attacks under a sickly glow. When darkness falls on Ypres now, it does not bring rest. It brings a different color of fear. You drift along the trenches under a sky dimmed by low clouds and intermittent flashes of artillery. The night is punctuated by flares that hang briefly in the air, bathing the torn landscape in pallid light before fading and dropping back to earth. In that flickering illumination, you see the new face of gas shell warfare. A barrage begins without warning, shells shrieking overhead, explosions walking their way across no man's land. The men hunch in their trenches, every muscle braced, listening past the thunder for subtler signs. It isn't just the sound of impact they fear now, but the sighing hiss that sometimes follows it. From some of the craters, a dim, pale mist rises. It curls and folds along the ground, barely visible unless the flares catch it just right. When they do, the gas glows faintly, as if lit from within by the memory of the cylinders that birthed its older sibling. The light seems wrong on it, sliding off the haze in sickly shades that make the air look diseased. Masks snap up in the trenches. Breaths shorten and become slow, deliberate. Officers move along the line in a half-crouch, checking that the men have covered their faces, reminding them with flattened gestures to stay low, to watch where the gas flows. Their authority is quiet but urgent. There is no need for raised voices. Everyone understands what is at stake. You hover above one section where the gas drifts toward the parapet in uneven waves. The men there track its progress as if watching an animal hunt in the dark. They are learning to read the way it moves over ground, how it slides into shell holes, how it hesitates at rises and stumbles over uneven soil, how it clings to places where water has gathered. The night amplifies everything. Sound carries farther. The faintest cough seems loud. The distant clatter of German equipment, the soft grind of boots, the low, indistinct murmur of orders, all these noises thread through the bombardment and gas-wreathed flares in a way that feels unreal. And then, through the intermittent glow, movement appears. German infantry materialize out of the haze, not in massed ranks but in scattered groups, probing for weaknesses along the line. They use the confusion of shellfire and gas to cloak their approach, hoping to find a section where men have broken or fled. But the trenches are not empty tonight. The soldiers within them, Canadian, British, French, remain at their posts, masks in place, rifles ready. They fire not in wild panic, but in controlled bursts, even as their eyes sting and their throats scratch behind the gauze. Discipline has become a weapon to wield against the fog. You drift higher, seeing how the battlefield becomes a shifting patchwork of danger. Here a crater thick with gas, avoided by both sides. There a trench line where men are pressed flat, waiting for the worst to pass. Beyond that, a strip of earth where attackers and defenders trade fire through thinning mist. Occasionally, a man misjudges the danger and stumbles into a low pocket of gas. A figure falls in a crater and does not rise again, even though no bullet struck him. Another, moving between cover points, suddenly drops to his knees, clutching his chest. His comrades drag him back, masks sliding askew in the struggle, risking their own breaths to spare his. The night attacks emphasized by gas shell fire do not break the line entirely. But they do something else. They fray it. You sense the cumulative weight of it settling on the men. The realization that there is no longer any clear division between times of gas and times without. The old hope that danger might come in waves, with intervals of safety in between, begins to fade. Now everything feels threaded with potential poison. Daylight, darkness, barrage, lull. The battlefield itself seems stained by the memory of chlorine. Even on nights when no gas shells are used, men wake with a sensation that the air is thicker than it should be. They sniff cautiously, check the wind, glance up at the flapping cloth on its stick. The fear of gas shells outlives the shells themselves. You drift above the darkened front, watching the way the flares rise and fall, casting momentary glimpses of a world where earth, metal, and air have all been turned against those living upon them. The sickly light reveals what the day tries to bury. Gas is no longer an extraordinary horror. It is now part of the weather of war. The shells have learned to carry it. The night has learned to hold it. And the men below have had to learn how to live, fight, and try to sleep beneath a sky that might at any moment breathe poison back down. Silence after the cloud. The battlefield empties. When the violence finally ebbs, it does not end with triumph or clarity. It ends with silence. You drift above the battlefield in the late hours of the night, as the last streaks of chlorine fade into memory. The wind has shifted again, carrying away the remnants of the sickly haze. Moonlight settles over the torn earth, pale and indifferent, illuminating a landscape that feels transformed by something deeper than artillery. The trenches are quieter now. Not calm, quiet. A quiet shaped by exhaustion so deep it borders on numbness. The men who remain stand in small, dispersed clusters, their bodies slouched against trench walls or leaning over parapets as breaths slow and steady themselves. Their masks hang loose around their necks, damp and stained. Their throats burn. Their eyes sting. Some cough softly into their sleeves, as though afraid to disturb the uneasy air. You hover above a group of soldiers who kneel by the parapet, staring out across the fields where the Colonial sector once stood. Their faces hold the same hollow expression, the look of men trying to understand an event that has no precedent in their memories. The ground before them is littered with shapes, figures lying in shallow hollows, caught in the posture of their last attempt to breathe. Bodies half submerged in shell holes where gas pooled. Silhouettes slumped against trench walls that became their last shelter. The dead lie where they fell, untouched for the moment because any attempt to retrieve them risks disturbing pockets of lingering gas. Every shallow depression, every collapsed dugout, every ditch carved by shrapnel is treated with wary respect. The earth itself has become unpredictable. The silence is broken only by the smallest sounds. The weak cough of a man who inhaled too much gas but not enough to kill. The distant clatter of a dropped entrenching tool. The soft rustle of a medic rearranging blankets around the wounded. Even the animals are quiet. No birds stir in the trees. No horses nicker or stamp their hooves. The entire front feels suspended in a breath it can no longer trust. You drift lower, moving across ground that feels almost sacred in its stillness, not with reverence, but with the weight of unspoken questions. You sense them in the air, carried in the minds of every soldier awake tonight. What happens when air becomes murder? What shape does a war take when breath is a battlefield? The moonlight touches a shallow hollow where two Colonial soldiers lie together, arms intertwined as though they reached for each other when the gas took hold. Their faces are peaceful now, the agony erased by stillness. But the posture of their bodies tells the story without a single word. You linger over another scene, a stretcher overturned in the mud, one handle snapped. The man who once lay upon it lies only a few feet away, as though he was set down gently and then left. His mask remains pressed awkwardly against his cheek, one strap torn loose during the chaos. In a trench farther on, a young soldier sits with his back against the wall, head tilted upward, eyes open to the sky. His chest rises and falls, faintly but still alive. A medic kneels beside him, checking his breaths in slow, measured intervals. The soldier's hand rests limply on the medic's sleeve, as though tethering himself to the world by touch alone. You drift past them, through the broken remnants of earth and wood and bodies and breath, feeling how the night settles over everything like a shroud. The panic of the afternoon has drained away. The brutality of the counterattack has burned itself out. And now, only the aftermath remains. A silence heavy enough to bruise the mind. A silence shaped by absence, of voices, of movement, of certainty. Even the wind moves cautiously now. Stillness in a sickly light. As dawn approaches, the sky begins to lighten with a faint, pale glow. The horizon takes on muted shades of yellow and grey, neither sunrise nor daylight, but something caught in between. You drift across the field as this dim light spills over the landscape, revealing its wounds in slow detail. The battlefield looks both familiar and entirely changed. Shell holes pockmark the earth in irregular constellations. Trench lines twist and sag where timber has been shattered. Broken rifles lie half buried in mud, their barrels dark with moisture. But it is the bodies that draw the eye, not in gore or spectacle, but in number and posture and the strange calm that surrounds them. Some lie curled as though asleep, hands near their faces, bodies pulled inward in the last instinctive attempt to protect themselves from air that betrayed them. Others lie on their backs, mouths open to a sky that did not save them. Some cluster in groups, where one man fell and another tried to help, only to share his fate. The gas has left its signature on the ground. Here, a pool of water glows faintly, its surface tinged with residue. There, grass lies flattened not by footsteps, but by the weight of deadly vapor that pressed downward before dissipating. You drift across the Colonial trenches, now eerie in their silence. Their parapets are broken, their duckboards splintered. The once living presence of thousands has been replaced by the muted stillness of a place abandoned by time. The smell has changed too. The acrid bite of chlorine has faded, but its ghost remains, a chemical sharpness woven into the damp morning air, impossible to forget even when invisible. Men breathe shallowly because they remember its taste. In the quiet, whispered impressions drift from trench to trench, soft reflections about the men who stood here, about how quickly breath became the dividing line between life and death. A few voices murmur uncertain thoughts about what war has become, as though trying to reconcile the familiar logic of bullets with this new, drifting terror. No one speaks with certainty. No one claims understanding. Everyone carries the same weight. You move toward a section of the field where medics begin to move again. They walk carefully, checking each body for signs of life or for those rare few who still breathe shallowly. Their faces are lined with exhaustion, but also with a quiet reverence. They work slowly. The ground is still not fully trusted. As they lift the first bodies onto stretchers, the sun finally breaks through the low clouds, a muted, diffused light that washes the landscape in a soft, sickly glow. The illumination reveals a truth the darkness had kindly concealed. The dead lie in patterns shaped by gas, not by combat, not by bullets, not by explosions, but by the simple, catastrophic need to breathe. You drift above it all, seeing the entire shape of the battlefield at once. The Colonial trenches, emptied by poison. The Canadian lines, bent but unbroken. The German advance halted but not erased. The civilians sheltering in lofts, afraid to descend. The hospitals overflowing with men whose lungs remind them of what the air did. And now this, a morning where silence holds as much terror as any bombardment. Nothing moves except the medics and the faint stir of wind. Nothing cries out except the distant calls of stretcher-bearers marking positions. Nothing asks to be understood, yet everything demands it. This is the silence after the cloud. A silence shaped by the knowledge that war has changed. A silence that settles into the bones. A silence that will echo long after the last gas wisp disperses. You drift among the wounded and the fallen, sensing how the world itself pauses here, unwilling to step forward too quickly, as though afraid another cloud might rise behind it. But even in this quiet, one truth remains. Breath, the simplest act of life, has become a battlefield. Orders written in a poisoned world. Runners carry confusion. Morning settles uneasily across the rear positions, far enough from the front to feel removed from the immediate danger, but close enough that the air still carries a faint metallic tang. Here lies the fragile nervous system of the army. Lantern-lit dugouts, canvas roof shelters, long wooden tables stained with ink and mud, and the constant shuffle of boots carrying messages between commanders who no longer trust what they know. You drift into this world as the first runners arrive from the shattered sector. Their uniforms are streaked with mud and panic. Their eyes burn. Some cough between sentences as they try to speak. They carry orders, map fragments, scrawled impressions, and half-legible reports from officers who barely had time to write. The information is contradictory, fear turned into handwriting. One runner collapses onto a crate, clutching his knees, breathing in sharp, stuttering gasps. Another kneels beside him with a canteen, trying to help him drink even as the water spills over cracked lips. The officers standing nearby exchange looks that are more hollow than surprised. Confusion becomes a kind of fog in its own right. You move above the cluster of tables where officers gather around maps that no longer reflect the world outside. The Colonial sector is marked as holding firm, an assumption made only yesterday, but the runner's voice trembles as he points to the southern edge of the line. He gestures toward a place where the green cloud rolled through like a tide. His finger shakes. His breath hitches. He tries to explain, but the words come out tangled, soft, broken. The officers lean in, listening, their faces pale. You sense their internal struggle. Part of them wants to dismiss what they hear as exaggeration, but the haunted look in the runner's eyes stops them. One officer marks the Colonial frontage with a long stroke of black charcoal, not to indicate enemy capture, but to indicate uncertainty, a region where the map no longer means anything. Other officers read through the written reports brought in. The pages tremble in their hands. Mud smears obscure sentences. Some words blur under the damp. Breath, burning, blindness. Their calm professional posture begins to crack. Nearby, a young clerk retches into the dirt behind the command dugout. Not from gas, he was nowhere near the front, but from the realization of what he has just transcribed. You drift over his shoulder as he wipes his mouth and returns to his desk, hands still trembling. He dips the pen into ink and continues writing. This is the moment the war widens, not by territory, but by terror. Lanterns, maps, and doubt. Inside the main command shelter, lanterns flicker against canvas walls, casting long shadows over the map tables. The officers gather tightly, their voices hushed, as though unwilling to disturb something hovering in the room. Reports spread like a slow-burning fire. Gas flowed low across the ground. Men fell without wounds. Chlorine clung to hollows and trenches. Retreats happened not because of bullets, but because of lungs. No one wants to speak the simple truth forming in their minds. A new weapon has entered the war. You drift above a table where fresh reports are laid out in rows. The paperwork carries the fingerprints of the men who wrote it, smudged, dirt-lined, hurried, panicked. Some sheets are torn at the corners where hands shook too violently. Officers move between tables, trying to interpret the scattered fragments into coherent meaning. Some pace with rigid shoulders. Others stand perfectly still, staring at nothing in particular, eyes lost in thought. A low, quiet impression drifts from one officer to another, that the Germans must have prepared this for months. Another wonders whether more clouds are gathering even now. A third voice, barely audible, suggests that the entire front could unravel if the wind shifts the wrong way. None of these thoughts are recorded, but all of them shape the room. You drift closer to a pair of officers studying the wind chart pinned to the wall, a chart that, until yesterday, was used mostly for artillery calculations. Now it has taken on a new importance, its arrows and notations suddenly representing survival rather than accuracy. One man runs his finger along the line that shows yesterday's breeze, tracing its path as if he can redraw the past. Another marks the current wind direction, his pencil tapping twice before he sets it down with a heavy sigh. Outside, more runners arrive, breathless, coughing, shaking, delivering updates that contradict each other. Some say the Colonial line broke instantly. Others insist pockets held out for an hour or more. Some claim the gas cloud was as tall as a man. Others say it crawled like a living thing. You hover over the map table as officers try to reconcile these accounts. They redraw the front 3 times in an hour. Each version looks worse. Eventually, a captain steps back, massaging his brow with ink-stained fingers. The lines on the map blur in his vision. He blinks rapidly, unsure if it is exhaustion or fear. In the silence, a single realization takes shape. The war no longer obeys the rules they studied. Birth of the first anti-gas orders. As afternoon approaches, the light outside dims behind clouds gathering over the rear positions. Inside the command shelter, officers sit in tight semicircles around a table where a blank sheet of paper lies waiting. Someone must write orders. Someone must decide how men are to survive the next cloud. No manuals exist. No doctrines. No precedent in any war they have read about. You drift above as a senior officer takes up a pencil. His hand hovers over the page, unsure where to begin. The air feels thick, not with gas, but with the weight of responsibility. He writes slowly at first. Men are advised. He stops, crosses it out. Troops are to cover. Another pause. Another line scratched away. You watch as he adjusts the lantern on the table, bringing its light closer. The flame wobbles. The pencil returns to the page. This time he writes more deliberately. In the event of unusual smoke or vapor, all ranks are to cover the mouth and nose with any available damp cloth. Another officer leans in, reading over his shoulder. A whispered suggestion. Include instructions for wetting cloth with whatever water is available. The pencil scratches again. Cloths soaked in water provide limited but useful protection. Someone else murmurs the crude field remedy: urine applied to cloth. The officer hesitates. He cannot bring himself to write it in such blunt terms. Instead, he adds, certain liquids may neutralize harmful vapors in emergencies. The ambiguity is deliberate. The meaning is understood. Another officer suggests that warnings must be given before a cloud is released. How? The Germans chose the moment. The moment depends on the wind. At last, they write. Posts must be assigned to observe wind direction at all times. A corporal brings in a handful of tattered cloth strips tied to branches, improvised wind indicators created by trench soldiers themselves. He demonstrates the way they are planted in the earth, the way they flutter even under faint breezes. The officers watch with a mixture of humility and grim admiration. You drift above them as they incorporate this crude wisdom into the official orders. Wind indicators are to be placed at intervals along the line. Another officer adds, movement into low-lying areas is to be minimized following bombardment. Every sentence smells of urgency. Every phrase carries the ghost of yesterday's failure. By the time the orders are done, the sheet holds a page of instructions that would have sounded absurd only a week ago. Now they feel insufficient, incomplete, and terrifyingly necessary. The senior officer signs the bottom with a shaking hand. The first anti-gas directive in the history of modern warfare is born. The cost of understanding. As the orders are copied by clerks and sealed for delivery, you drift outside into the grey, fading light. Runners stand ready to carry these fragile instructions to the front. Their boots are caked in mud. Their eyes look hollow. Some still cough from the green cloud hours earlier. They accept the sealed envelopes with a solemnity reserved for messages that might save lives, or arrive too late to matter. A few stretch their legs, preparing for another sprint through roads still slick with last night's rain. One adjusts the straps on his pack with trembling fingers. Another wipes his eyes, uncertain if the moisture is from gas residue or exhaustion. Behind them, officers step out of the command shelter, blinking into the overcast light. They look older than they did yesterday. The weight of decision sits heavily on their shoulders. You drift higher, sensing how the rear lines have changed. Maps now tremble under the lanterns. Orders smell faintly of chlorine. Ink smears when touched by hands that shook during writing. Nothing about this is routine anymore. War has always been chaos, but this is a new kind of confusion, a quiet, suffocating fear, wrapped in paper, signed in ink, carried by men who breathe carefully as they run. You watch the first runner break into a jog, then a sprint, disappearing toward the front with the new orders pressed tightly against his chest. Another follows, then another. Their footsteps fade into the murmur of distant shelling. The wind shifts slightly. Every eye lifts. No one speaks. No one needs to. They all know now. The front is no longer just a line in the mud. It is wherever the air moves. And the men who send orders, the men who carry them, and the men who receive them now share a single, heavy truth. War has learned to breathe. Burial parties in a green dawn, the first steps into the field. Dawn does not so much arrive as seep slowly into the sky. A pale light spreads over Ypres, thin and reluctant, as if the sun itself has second thoughts about shining on this ground. The air feels cooler, cleaner than it did during the gas attack, yet no one trusts it. Every breath is measured. Every inhalation feels like a question. You drift along the forward trenches as the first burial parties are assembled. They are not chosen because they are stronger or braver. They are chosen because someone must go. A list is read in low tones. Men step forward with the resigned movements of people volunteering for a task no one truly wants, but everyone knows must be done. Some adjust their masks. Others check the straps on their rifles, though the rifles are mostly symbolic now. The enemies they face in this work have no uniforms. They gather shovels, stretchers, blankets, and coils of rope. A few carry canvas body bags, still folded, as though hoping they might remain unused. The ground beyond the trench line waits for them, a landscape of shallow hollows and lingering doubts. The officers give final instructions. Move slowly. Test the air. Avoid low places where vapors may still cling. Bring back who you can. The words are practical. The weight behind them is not. You float above as the first party climbs over the parapet and steps out into no man's land. Their boots sink into mud that has not yet forgotten the weight of running feet and falling bodies. A hush falls over the trench behind them, as if everyone watching has subconsciously held their breath. The burial detail moves in a thin line, maintaining distance from one another, each man scanning the ground ahead for both obvious dangers and the more subtle signs of remaining gas. Their masks hang ready, some already in place despite the discomfort, lenses fogging slightly with each exhale. The world out here is quiet. Too quiet. No gunfire interrupts the slow march. No shells fall nearby. The Germans are silent, watching from their own positions, perhaps honoring an unspoken pause or simply unwilling to move through ground still haunted by their own weapon. The burial parties continue forward, into the soft, sickly light. Among the fallen. The first bodies appear not far from the trenches, lying where the gas caught men who tried to flee. Some are sprawled on their backs, arms outstretched as though reaching for something beyond their grasp. Others lie curled on their sides, knees drawn up, hands near their faces in a last attempt to shield their breath. You drift among them as the burial detail approaches. The soldiers pause before each fallen figure, standing silent for a heartbeat that feels longer than it is. The expressions on their faces vary: sorrow, numbness, quiet shock. But beneath them all lies a shared reluctance to touch men who suffered in ways they can barely understand. Still, they kneel. Hands, clumsy with fatigue and the tremor of memory, begin their work. One man gently straightens a body's arms, folding them over the chest. Another closes eyes stuck halfway open, lashes still stiff with dried tears. A blanket is spread, and the body lifted, one man at the shoulders, one at the feet, their motions slow, careful, almost reverent. The work is silent except for breath and the soft squelch of boots in mud. You hover above them, watching the rhythm form. Pause, kneel, straighten, lift, carry, lay down in a new resting place slightly farther back, where burial pits are already being dug. The gas has left its marks here. Some faces are grey or greenish. Some lips bear traces of foam. A few throats show strained muscles frozen mid-spasm. The men of the burial detail do not dwell on these signs, but they cannot avoid them. Every time they lean closer, every time they adjust a collar or tuck in a hand, they see what the air has done. The knowledge lodges deeper in their lungs each time they inhale, even through a mask. A horse stands a short distance away, reins dragging, eyes wide and rolling. It blows air through flared nostrils, refusing to step closer to a shallow hollow where several bodies lie together. The animal senses something the men already know. The low places are dangerous. The burial party circles wide around that hollow, approaching the bodies from the highest point they can find. One man tests the air at the edge, dipping his head slightly, watching for the telltale sting in his eyes. He hesitates, then lifts his mask higher over his face. Only then do they step in. Gas in the ground. As the morning matures into a muted, colorless day, the burial parties move deeper into the fields. You drift ahead of them, seeing what lies in their path before they do. Here, a group of Colonial soldiers lies clustered near a broken stretch of trench. Their uniforms are caked in mud and dust, but hints of bright color still show through where gas did not stain them. Their positions speak of desperation. Some collapse together, others alone, a few with hands still clutching at scarves or cloths pressed to their mouths. The men of the burial detail pause longer here. Something in the sight of the Colonial dead, so far from their own homes, their bodies folded into foreign earth, pulls at them differently. The silence around this group feels heavier, the air denser. One soldier kneels and adjusts a man's cap, straightening it with the same care someone might give to the living before a parade. Another gently separates two men whose arms are locked together, as though they clung to each other until their lungs failed. He hesitates before moving them, hand lingering momentarily on a shoulder in apology. The gas still whispers from the ground. In some low spots, a faint shimmer dances above the soil, like heat mirage on a summer road. The burial party recognizes this for what it is. They move with heightened caution, stepping only where they must, avoiding dips and trenches that feel too still. At one point, a soldier bends to lift a body and inhales too sharply. He recoils, coughing, mask askew. Another member of the detail reaches out, steadying him, helping him adjust the mask back into place with practiced urgency. For a moment, fear ripples through the group. They wait to see if the coughing becomes more than just reaction. It fades slowly. They move on. You hover above them as they continue to retrieve the dead, one by one, sometimes two by two. Stretcher-bearers carry their burdens carefully, as if afraid any sudden jolt might disturb something sacred. Behind them, shallow graves and temporary resting trenches begin to fill, rows of bodies laid side by side, not by rank or regiment, but by the simple order in which they were found. Identification is attempted where possible, tags checked, pockets searched, small personal objects noted and set aside. A worn photograph. A letter folded carefully in a breast pocket. A small religious medal, its chain broken. These items are collected in small, labeled bundles, each no heavier than the palm of a hand, each carrying the weight of an entire life. The weight of each body. Time blurs in this work. The burial detail moves, lifts, carries, lowers, covers, over and over. The rhythm is slow enough to be deliberate, but relentless enough to exhaust. You drift alongside one soldier who has carried more than his share today. His shoulders sag beneath the weight of each body. His hands are rubbed raw beneath the edges of his gloves. The muscles in his back protest with every lift, but he continues, one step, one burden at a time. His face remains mostly expressionless now, not because he feels nothing, but because he feels too much. At one point, he pauses beside a body lying half in a shell hole, half on its edge. The man's hand is outstretched, fingers digging into the mud as though he tried, even at the last, to pull himself higher, away from the gas pooling below. The soldier stands over him for a long moment before kneeling. He gently pries the fingers loose, one by one. He murmurs something in his thoughts, not a word spoken aloud, but a silent recognition that this man fought the air itself and lost. With the help of another, he lifts the body and carries it away from the poison-soaked hollow. The repetition continues until muscles stop shaking, not because they have grown stronger, but because they have passed beyond trembling into a kind of numbness. The body moves on memory, the mind trailing behind, still trapped in the first moments of the morning. You drift higher, seeing all the burial parties at once. Small groups like dark stitches across the pale, ruined fabric of the fields. Each man a tiny moving point, each body a stillness being gathered from the earth. Shovels dig into softened soil. Blades strike rock. Earth falls back in soft, heavy cascades. In some places, crosses or markers will follow later. For now, many graves remain temporary, a promise of future recognition, a placeholder in a war that does not yet know how long it will last. Quiet rituals in a poisoned landscape. As the day begins to lean toward afternoon, the work slows. Not because the dead are all found, there will always be more, but because the men can only carry so much weight in a single day, both in their bodies and in their minds. The burial details gather near the last of the graves they will fill for now. A few stand with heads bowed, not in formal ceremony, but in a posture that feels instinctive. Helmets tilt forward. Hands rest on shovel handles or rifle stocks. No prayer is spoken aloud, yet something like one exists in the silence. You drift close enough to see the small gestures. A hand brushing dirt gently from a man's sleeve. A helmet straightened on a still head. A piece of cloth laid carefully over a face before the first shovelful of soil falls. These are rituals without official sanction, unrecorded in any after-action report. They exist only here, between the living and the dead, in a field that smells faintly of damp earth and the fading ghost of chlorine. In the distance, the front still hums with low-level activity, artillery adjusting ranges, engineers repairing damaged sections of trench, officers issuing new instructions about wind and masks. Life moves on with a mechanical determination that war demands. But here, for a moment, time slows. The men of the burial party step back from the freshly filled graves, breathing heavily through masks pushed up onto their foreheads or hanging at their throats. Sweat cools on their skin. Their hands hang at their sides. No one speaks. No one needs to. You rise slowly above them, taking in the entire scene. Long, rough lines of earth marking where bodies now rest. Scattered shapes still waiting to be found. Men walking back toward the trenches with slower steps than when they left. The landscape looks slightly less chaotic now. Death has been given a semblance of order, but nothing about it feels resolved. These graves do not close the story of the green cloud. They only give it form. The gas does not care about burial. It has already done its work. What remains is for humans to restore some fragment of dignity to those it suffocated. As the burial parties make their way back toward the trenches, shoulders bowed beneath invisible weight, the wind stirs again. Everyone notices. Eyes lift. Faces turn. The breeze is gentle, harmless, for now. But every man who walked that field today will feel its touch differently, will remember how it once carried something that turned bodies into statues in shallow hollows. And tomorrow, and the day after, when they pass near these graves, they will know. This is where the air turned against them. Letters home that never said the word gas, words written in the shadows. Evening returns to the Ypres sector with a kind of exhausted softness. the sky dimming in slow gradients until only the faintest embers of daylight cling to the torn edges of the trenches. Lanterns flicker to life one by one, casting warm, fragile circles of light that feel impossibly gentle compared to the horrors of the past day. You drift among the men as they settle into these small islands of yellow glow, each soldier searching for a moment's stillness. The air has grown clearer, the wind calmer, but no one trusts either. Cloth masks lie within arm's reach. Damp fabric dries slowly on sandbags. All around, faint coughing punctuates the dusk. It is letter-writing time. The army encourages it. Command believes it lifts morale. But tonight, the act feels different. Heavier, quieter, more private. You float beside a soldier sitting with his back against a trench wall. His uniform is stiff from dried mud, his fingers rubbed raw, his breathing still uneven from the day before. He holds a small writing pad on his knee and a pencil worn down to a stub. The first lines come slowly. He hesitates, searching for a way to describe the day without breaking rules or breaking hearts. He starts with common phrases: the weather, the rations, a recent parcel received, as though trying to warm his hand before touching the truth. The words feel thin, almost hollow. He pauses, staring at the page. You sense his thoughts drifting toward the green cloud that rolled across the fields, the screams that turned into silence, the taste of chlorine that still burns faintly in his throat. But none of those images make it onto the paper. He writes instead that it has been a trying week, and that he is keeping well. The gap between what he lived and what he writes is so vast it feels like a wound. All around the trench, others do the same. A man near the fire step folds his body inward, shielding his paper from the breeze, and writes to his wife about the sound of birds returning in the distance, a detail he clings to because it feels like something alive. Another soldier, barely out of boyhood, writes to his mother that the officers are proud of the unit's discipline. He leaves out the part where he vomited into his mask while dragging a friend out of a gas pocket. Farther down, a man traces the outline of a small pressed flower tucked inside his notebook, a keepsake from home. He stares at it for a long time before writing about how he misses the scent of real fields, the kind that don't hide death in the grass. None of them write the word gas, not because they lack the courage to speak it, but because they know it will be struck out by the censors, or because they cannot bear to let loved ones imagine what it felt like to breathe poison. You drift among them, feeling how each pencil stroke becomes both confession and concealment. Censors who know too much. Behind the front, in a dimly lit tent that smells of ink, mud, and tired breath, sits the other half of the letter-writing ritual. The censors. A handful of clerks, officers, and weary scribes sort through stacks of envelopes and folded sheets of paper, each one a fragile connection between the front and distant homes. They work by lantern light, their eyes tracing the curves of handwriting, searching for anything that the army deems unfit to be sent. You drift behind them as they read. Some letters are breezy, full of jokes and reassurances that sound almost real. Others carry a tremor beneath the surface, shaky handwriting, smudged lines, sentences started then crossed out. The censors are supposed to read quickly, efficiently, checking for references to troop movements, positions, or anything that might compromise security. But tonight, something slows them down. Letter after letter contains veiled hints of something terrible. Descriptions of strange smoke. A rough day. Men who went down without wounds. The censors recognize the patterns. They have heard the rumors. They have seen the runners coughing, their eyes red. They know enough to understand what is being left unsaid. One censor pauses as he reads a line describing a friend who couldn't catch his breath and then went quiet. His hand hesitates over the black pencil he uses to strike out sensitive information. He does not strike anything this time. The soldier has already censored himself. Another letter describes a bad patch of ground where men fell quickly. The censor underlines nothing. The sentence is vague enough to pass, but its meaning gnaws at him anyway. A younger censor wipes his eyes, blaming the smoke from the lantern, though his hands tremble slightly as he moves on to the next letter. These men have never seen gas up close, but they feel its presence in the words. It lingers in the pauses. It echoes in the half-finished thoughts. It hides in the careful reassurances written by hands that shook while writing. No one says the word aloud here either. Yet every man in the tent knows that something new has entered the war. Something so unsettling that soldiers can only refer to it indirectly, and censors cannot bear to erase it even when they should. You drift above the entire tent, watching black pencils hover over lines but rarely strike, as though the act of crossing out these fears would make them more real. The letters are resealed, placed in sacks, and set aside to be carried far from Ypres, far from Chlorine's scent, far from the shallow hollows filled earlier that day. They will arrive in kitchens, parlors, farms, and city apartments where no one imagines the truth behind the words. Across distance, the home front waits. You drift farther, beyond the trenches and command tents, beyond the rail lines and horse lines and muddy roads that connect the front to the rest of the world. You drift into the quiet homes of those who wait. In a small village miles from the front, a woman stands by her window, holding a letter just delivered by the postman. The paper smells faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, ordinary scents for wartime mail. She reads the first lines, smiling softly at her husband's attempts to sound cheerful. She does not see the smudge on the corner where he paused to steady his hand. She does not hear the coughing fit that forced him to stop writing for a moment. She cannot imagine the green cloud he chose not to describe. The letter tells her that he is tired but in good spirits, that the unit held its ground, that he hopes the spring planting goes well. He writes that he dreams of home every night. He adds a line about the weather, cool mornings, warmer afternoons. He does not mention that the air itself burned him. You drift farther, into a small apartment where a mother reads her son's letter by the flicker of a candle. Her hands are thin, her eyes lined with worry. The letter reassures her that the officers are kind and that the men are managing well. She presses the page to her chest, whispering a hope that he stays safe. She does not know that her son saw a friend die without a scratch on his body. In another home, a father sits at a kitchen table with his glasses pushed low on his nose. He reads slowly, savoring each line, nodding at familiar jokes and small details from camp life. He notices the handwriting is shakier than usual, but he attributes it to cold weather or fatigue. He has no idea what chlorine does to a man's hands when he tries to crawl out of a gas pocket. Letters everywhere carry half-truths wrapped in affection. You drift through dozens of homes, villages, towns, each family reading words carefully chosen not to frighten, each reader unaware of the weight carried in every unspoken sentence. Night thoughts unsent. Night deepens over the Ypres sector as the last letters are folded and placed into envelopes. Soldiers tuck them into their tunics to hand off at the next collection. But not every letter is sent. You drift along the trench line, noticing small scraps of paper tucked into corners, buried in pockets, or torn into pieces and scattered along the mud where no one will find them intact. These are the drafts, the words too true, too raw, too frightening to reach home. One torn piece reads only, "The air burned." Another fragment says, "I thought I would die there." A larger scrap, folded sharply and then discarded, holds more. They fell like wheat in the wind. I will never forget the sound. The rest of the page is missing. A few soldiers keep these unsent drafts tucked deep in their pockets, unable to throw them away but unwilling to mail them. The paper is stiff with dirt, sweat, and the faint trace of chemical residue. You drift above one man who sits alone in a narrow recess of the trench, writing line after line only to cross each one out. His pencil moves with desperate speed, but the page remains mostly empty. Finally, he stops, closes his notebook, and leans his head against the wall. The letter he sends home instead is only 4 lines long. He is well. He is thinking of her. The weather has been difficult. He hopes to write more soon. And then he signs his name. You watch his chest rise and fall, breathing carefully in the night air. This is how truth survives in wartime, not in the words sent home, but in the words that stay behind in the mud, buried with the men who could not finish writing. The silence between sentences. As lanterns dim and soldiers settle into uneasy rest, you drift above the trench line, feeling the weight of everything that was written today, and everything that was not. Letters flutter slightly in the breeze, held down by helmets or stones to keep them from blowing away. The wind lifts them gently, as if trying to read over the soldiers' shoulders. You sense the stories carried across miles. Stories of fear softened into vague discomfort. Stories of courage hidden behind reassurances. Stories of death concealed beneath lines about weather. Stories of chlorine transformed into silence. Families will read these letters with gratitude, relief, pride, never knowing that their sons, brothers, husbands, and friends breathed poison and dug graves for men who suffocated beside them. Tomorrow, more letters will be written. Some will hide truth even more carefully. Some will tremble with unspoken memories. A few may grow bold enough to hint at what happened. But none will use the word that defines the day. None will write chlorine. None will write gas. None will describe the green cloud that swept across Ypres. That word belongs only to those who were there, to those who breathed it, feared it, survived it, or died beneath it. You rise slowly, drifting above the lantern-lit trenches, watching paper and ink hold back a world too heavy to share. In this silence between sentences, the truth lingers, in the lungs of the men, in the ground still tasting of poison, in the air that once turned deadly, and in the letters that never said the word gas, but carried its shadow home. Epilogue. A war that stops trusting the air. Morning settles over Ypres in hesitant layers, as though the sky itself is unsure whether it should reveal what lies beneath. The pale dawn light reaches across the broken fields, softening the sharp edges of shattered earth, resting gently on the quiet lines of trenches, and casting a muted glow over the burial mounds left behind by the day's grim work. You drift above it all, moving slowly through the stillness that follows catastrophe. Nothing moves with certainty. Nothing breathes without caution. This is a world waking from a nightmare with its heart still racing. The soldiers stir in the dimness, eyes swollen with exhaustion, bodies stiff from digging, carrying, lifting, and hauling the dead. Their uniforms are stiff with dried mud and stained with a chalky residue of chlorine. They rise carefully, as though afraid the air might shift again and betray them. Breath is no longer a simple act. It is a calculation, a risk, a memory of lungs that fought and lost. Some men sit on the parapets, elbows on knees, watching the horizon as the sun climbs in slow increments. They check the wind without thinking, an instinct now woven into muscle and habit. A faint movement of air across a cheek is enough to stiffen their shoulders. A shift in the direction of a tattered cloth tied to a stick draws every eye nearby. You drift past them, sensing how the silence here has a shape of its own. A hollow, heavy calm born not from peace, but from survival. War has taken many things already. Today, it has taken trust in the air. A land that remembers. As the day brightens, a subtle mist lingers along the ground. It is harmless now, nothing more than the cool breath of morning over wet fields. But no one trusts the softness of it. Soldiers watch the low-lying vapors and inhale only shallowly, as though the earth might exhale something cruel if disturbed. The ground itself feels bruised. You drift lower, touching the edges of the places where gas pooled the day before. Nothing visible remains, yet the soil seems marked by something deeper. Grass lies flattened, not by boots but by the weight of chlorine that pressed heavily upon it. Water in the shell holes glints unnaturally in the faint light, reflecting not just the sky but the memory of death. A few soldiers stand near these hollows, gazing into them with expressions caught between reverence and dread. One pauses with a hand on the rim of a crater, breathing slowly through a damp cloth, even though no gas rises from it now. He remembers what he saw yesterday, men collapsing mid-step, eyes wide, mouths open for air that betrayed them. You drift with him as he steps back, unwilling to stand too close. Nature itself seems complicit. The wind carries the faintest scent of chlorine, imagined perhaps, but powerful. Birdsong feels cautious, scattered. Horses flare their nostrils and refuse to approach certain dips in the terrain. The earth remembers. The animals remember. The air remembers. And so do the men. The gas wounded. Far behind the lines, in a field hospital tent shaded by canvas and propped up with poles scavenged from shattered wagons, the air holds the smell of antiseptic, sweat, mud, and something acrid that will not wash away. This is where the gas-wounded lie. You drift inside, moving carefully between beds where men struggle to breathe. Their chests rise and fall in shallow, strained motions, each breath drawn through a throat that feels scraped raw. Some cough endlessly, the sound hoarse and wet. Others lie very still, eyes half open, as though focusing all their strength on the simple act of inhaling. Nurses move between them with quiet urgency. Their hands tremble not from fear, but from the number of men who need them. One nurse gently pours water between a soldier's cracked lips. Another lifts a man's head, holding him upright so he can draw what little air he can tolerate. Another applies ointment to seared skin, whispering reassurances more for herself than for him. None of them speak of gas. None of them say the word. But it fills the tent as surely as the moans and rattling breaths. You drift beside a nurse who sits momentarily at the edge of a cot, rubbing her aching wrists. She closes her eyes and inhales slowly, and even that breath carries caution. The patients closest to her cough violently at the smell of disinfectant. Some flinch at shadows passing across the tent's canvas wall, as though afraid the air itself is changing again. A doctor moves from bed to bed, checking pulses, listening to breaths that crackle and wheeze. He carries a notebook, its pages filled with observations that have no space in the medical manuals he studied. Lungs filled with fluid. Corneal burns. Wheezing persists despite rest. Pain on inhalation. Fear of breathing. He writes these notes without knowing how to treat them. Chlorine has given him more questions than cures. The gas-wounded do not scream. They whisper. They wheeze. They slip into unconsciousness without fanfare. This is a new kind of suffering. Quiet, internal, invisible to those who have never inhaled poison. You drift above their beds as night settles, lanterns dim, and the nurses rest their heads in their hands. War has opened a new chamber of pain, and no one knows how deep it goes. Civilians reclaiming the air. Farther from the front, in the farms and villages caught in the path of the green cloud, the air is clearer now, but it is not trusted. You drift among the homes where families step cautiously into their yards, eyes scanning for signs of tinted vapor or strange smells. Women hold damp cloths to their children's noses even though the danger has passed. Elders test the air by waving their hands slowly, watching the movement of dust motes. Inside homes, windows remain open, doors propped to allow fresh breezes. Yet every draught carries suspicion. Every breeze feels like a messenger from the trenches. Farmers inspect their wells, terrified the gas settled into the water. Some scoop handfuls and sniff cautiously before daring a sip. Animals behave strangely, cows refusing to enter barns where the fumes once drifted, dogs pacing restlessly, chickens clustered at the far ends of yards. A few families pack belongings in silence, deciding it is safer to flee than to wait for the next cloud. They do not look back as they walk down roads lined with puddles that glint faintly in the late light. Others try to restore normality, sweeping mud from their doorsteps, airing out blankets, gathering food from gardens untouched by war. But even these small acts carry hesitation. You drift through one farmhouse where a mother scrubs her children's faces with a trembling cloth, even though they show no signs of harm. She whispers fragments of old prayers as she works, her hands never stopping. Her husband stands in the doorway, watching the sky. This was not supposed to happen here. Not to fields and families. Not to people who never carried rifles or wore uniforms. War has slipped its boundaries. The front has dissolved. And civilians have learned the same lesson as soldiers. The wind can betray them. New drills in the dusk. Back in the trenches, as dusk descends once more, a whistle blows. Not for an attack. Not for a retreat. For a drill. You drift above the men as they gather for the first official anti-gas practice. They stand in loose formation, masks hanging around their necks, cloths ready. An officer explains the new procedures, though his voice remains subdued, as if raising it might disturb something sleeping in the soil. He holds up a crude gas mask, little more than gauze, flannel, and metal mesh. It is a prototype, hastily made in workshops behind the lines. The men watch with wary eyes. Some swallow hard. Some tug at the straps on their masks. Some breathe shallowly in anticipation. The officer gives the signal. Masks rise to faces. Cloths press against mouths and noses. Breaths turn thin and filtered. The trench becomes eerily quiet. The sound of hundreds of men inhaling through cloth is soft, rhythmic, almost ritualistic. You drift between them, sensing the tension behind every breath. No one jokes. No one complains. No one doubts why this is necessary. A few men practice tying the masks with trembling fingers, fumbling with straps until the officer gently corrects them. Others close their eyes, imagining how quickly they would have to act if the next cloud appeared without warning. This is the new war, not just steel and fire, but fabric and breath. The drill ends. Masks lower. The men exhale. But none of them feel relief. Practicing survival is not the same as surviving. The philosophy of breath. As night deepens, you rise high above the battlefield, seeing the whole wounded landscape at once. The trenches coil across the earth like scars. The graves lie in long, quiet lines. The gas-wounded sleep fitfully. Civilians clean their homes with trembling fingers. The wind moves slowly, softly, brushing over it all. Humans have always trusted breath. It is the first act of life, the last act before death. It is what binds the body to the world. But now breath carries memory, fear, a new kind of fragility. You float above soldiers sitting alone in dugouts, staring into the darkness as they listen to their own lungs, as though unsure whether the next inhale will soothe or betray them. A few write in journals words they dare not send home. The air is not ours anymore. I keep waking with the taste of metal. When the wind moves, I find myself praying. This is a war that strips certainty from the simplest functions of the body. It does not matter how strong a man is, how steady his aim, how disciplined his training. Poison can undo him with a single breath. The philosophy of breath becomes a constant undercurrent. To inhale is to risk. To exhale is to hope. To live is to trust that the next breath will not burn. You drift among them, feeling how fear has changed its shape, no longer tied to sound or motion, but to the invisible spaces between. The air they once cursed for being cold or damp is now something they fear for reasons beyond weather. And the world, realizing this, feels forever altered. Night descends on a changed world. The final hours of night settle over Ypres like ashes drifting from a distant fire. Lanterns dim. Voices fade. The front grows still again, not peaceful, but quiet with the weary acceptance of men who have survived what could not be understood. You drift one last time along the front. A soldier stands alone on the fire step, looking toward the Colonial sector where the cloud first rolled. His posture is heavy, his shoulders drooped, his breath slow. He watches the horizon the way a man watches a door he expects to open again. Another sits with his mask in his lap, turning it over in his hands, studying its crude stitching. He touches the gauze where teeth marks have frayed the edges. He closes his eyes and takes a slow breath through his nose, forcing himself to trust the air. A third kneels beside a section of trench wall where a fallen comrade had carved initials months before. He traces those initials with filthy fingers, then rests his forehead against the wood. No prayers are spoken aloud. No lamentations rise. The silence itself is the ritual. You drift higher and higher, watching how the battlefield shrinks into a single landscape, a wounded patch of earth holding thousands of stories. In the space between breaths, above it all, the wind moves gently, indifferent and eternal, and beneath that wind, a truth lingers. The world has seen its first great chemical attack. Its innocence has been stripped away with a single cloud. War has entered the lungs. Fear has entered the breath. And nothing, not drills, not letters, not dawn, can return the air to what it once was. This is not an ending. It is a threshold, a step from one kind of war into another, a step into a century where air itself becomes a weapon. You drift in that truth, letting it settle like dust over the field. Slowly, softly, the scene begins to fade.